Welcome back to another Loop Station tutorial. My name is Playgue, and today we're talking about the Reverb. The Reverb is available on Input Effects and Track Effects C only, so it can only be layered on the very base of whatever effects that we have. Definitely one of the most used effects on the device. For me, I looked it up on every track that I know so far, and it produced 88 results. I have more reverbs in my songs than I have actual songs. So yeah, reverb is very, very popular. What's really cool too is that reverb is really dependent on what mood you want your song to have. You can create atmosphere with this. You can create more chill vibes. You can create more intensity. Like, you can do so much with the reverb, and that is awesome. Let's go into the parameters. We have 3 parameters. We have time, we have effect level, and we have direct level. Now, the time is how long the reverb will last after the input. So I'm going to do a pop click, and we will hear how long that lasts with the reverb. The larger the time, the longer the actual reverb goes on for. And additionally, it stays louder for longer too. Whereas the shorter times, it fades out very quickly. The longer times, it will continue on and fade out slowly over time. This goes all the way up to 10 seconds, but we'll talk about this parameter in a little more details later. Effect level is how loud your reverb will be compared to your input. And this is what is controlled by the knob. This is one of the most useful things that the knob controls. And again, more on this later. And then lastly, we have your direct level. This is your input level, the sound that you make into the microphone or the instrument itself. So in my case, my instrument's my voice and my microphone. So as I will turn this down, you'll hear less and less of, the input that I am putting in, which is me talking, and it'll be just the reverb that you are hearing. This is if you don't want the input to be as harsh. You can reduce the direct level by a little bit. So let's talk about how long your reverb should be. Now, because it's in seconds, it will depend on your BPM. Now, MB14 has a formula that works reasonably well. I'll tell you my method. My method is I keep the default at 2.8 seconds, and then I adjust the volume, the E level, instead. So if I need a longer or shorter time, I will change this value instead of the time value. I can do that much quicker because I can just move it to the value that I need it with the input effects knob, and I don't have to actually go in and menu and change it to a specific time. Like, if I need a reverb of 100 and I want it to be at a certain volume by a certain beat, I will just adjust it according to the mix. At a certain point, you can't hear the reverb with your mix, so the time isn't too important, but your E level is. So that's how I end up doing it. This does not mean that I never adjust the time. For some tracks, I do have a longer reverb time or even a shorter reverb time, depending on the BPM and the mix itself. But for the most part, I'm not changing the time mid-track. let's talk about how to use the reverb. I use clock times to figure out the right value. By clock times, as you see on my cool sticker that I made here, I put little tick marks on each one of my knobs. These tick marks are clock times. So I can write in my notes, put reverb at 1 o'clock, and I know to put my reverb at 1 o'clock. I just use this tick mark here. So I just put it at that one there, and I'll have a consistent E level every single time I perform it. So some common clock times that I'll use is 10.5, which is about 33. This is the reverb that I'll use for my general beatboxing. Just kind of fills that space a little bit. But in any case, I'll also use 12 o'clock, which is 50. And this is really good for things like hi-hats. Next, I'll use 1 o'clock, which is about 63-ish, and as well as 2 o'clock, which is around 75. And then I'll also use 3 o'clock, which is around 88. And 88 to maxed out, like somewhere in between there, is really, really good for vocals. This is where it would be a good idea to change your reverb time if need be, is if you're dealing in ranges that are much larger and E levels, and you want your time of your reverb to be shorter or longer. That's where you can kind of listen to where to adjust your time. So let's talk about reverb as a track effect. Now, this can be used where you want to have your effects have reverb as well. If you put reverb down as you're recording, that reverb will also be reverbed, so you'll get more reverb and it'll make it more intense. I'll show you an example. I have 2 tracks here. Both were recorded with reverb. So we have a robot. You can hear the reverb in there. But if I add some reverb to it after the fact, you'll hear the difference that it makes and how it kind of blends it together. Notice that when I stop the tracks as well, the reverb continues to go as well. That is another reason why you might want to use the reverb, is to add that trail end when you stop tracks. Additionally, like I said before, if we add extra effects, like let's say a beat scatter, it'll also reverb the beat scatter. Amazing ending to a song with reverb. We can also use reverb to fill space in the song and make it feel bigger and more grand. So we're going to use the reverb to fill in the space that the slicer is going to be creating. Or in this case, we're using a filter to create a slicer. Alright, that's alright, but let's see what it sounds like with just some reverb added. Notice that the spaces are now being more filled with this reverb that we have going on here. The next technique that I'm going to be talking about here is a very common beatboxing technique. We will be flicking the reverb knob with snares. So when we do a snare, we will flick this knob up to create a more powerful snare sound. So I'm going to do a TCH snare, but I'm going to do it with 3 different ways. You'll see it in a second. So now we have 3 different snares here, all the same snare, but I did 3 different methods. So the first one had no reverb at all. Okay. Second one had reverb, but I didn't do anything to the knob. Notice I cut off the snare at the end of the recording, so the reverb itself also is cut off. So you hear the at the end because I've cut off the reverb from recording. If I didn't want that, I would let this overdub, and that it will overdub the tail end of the reverb into the beginning part, and it'll sound more complete. Or I could go into the reverb and adjust the time so then the reverb ends at a specific value. Or I could go in and I could, instead of having it at my normal 33, I could adjust it to something smaller, like maybe 20, and that would make the reverb end before the end of the bar. But I want you to listen to this one. Notice how much more full that snare sounds, but the reverb trail still ends before the track loops. And I did that by flicking the knob up when I do the actual sound and then flicking it back down after the sound. So this is really useful for your snare sounds and layering them into your song. Next idea we'll talk about is the direct level. It's a cool technique that you can use to make really spacey sounds and vocals is muting the direct level. So now it's not outputting any of the input that you put in, but it's still using your input for the reverb. So you're hearing only the reverb. And then if you increase the time to something really large, then you will end up with these really spacey, otherworldly kind of sounds. And if you do things like high notes, you can get some really weird stuff happening. Yeah, and then play a reverb in reverse, and you get, like, really weird stuff. Right on. So, yeah, and that's another technique that you can do, too. So any sound that you put in and reverse it, it can create this really cool riser effect. So I'll do, like, a little squeak into the microphone, but I'll have it on reverse first, and that's going to play it in reverse. But I want you to notice when I make the initial squeak sound. So just notice when I do that. So you noticed that I made the squeak sound here, the percussion back here. The reason I did that was because I didn't want the initial punch of that squeak to be recorded. So instead, it's just the reverb part of the sound that ends up being recorded, and then that ends up immediately getting reversed. So that will also come into play when you're trying to capture just reverbs of things, like in Move With A, when we're capturing the harmony that we create. I suppose I'll just show you. So like with the harmony at the beginning here. So I stopped making the part, vocalized part, and then I record the reverb part. So what that ends up doing is it just layers the reverbs. And that's a technique that can work with all kinds of different sounds. So whether you reverse it or just record the tail end of the reverb, you can use the reverb itself as its own sound and its own tool. We're almost done. I have one more thing to talk to you about, and that is the master reverb. So if you go into memory and right arrow over, you'll get to compression and reverb. This is your master reverb. It affects everything that you do. It affects what you are currently inputting as well as what is already playing in the moment. So a lot of songs sound good with just a little bit of reverb. So oftentimes I will have like a 3 to 5 on the master reverb, and that just, it gives it that little bit of extra like seasoning. It's just like you're seasoning your dish. You can also use the master reverb to free up a space on your track effects. So because it affects everything, you won't be able to like isolate it to a specific track. But if you want that, like filling that space or a little bit more of that reverb in there, you can use this. You can turn it up like mid-track if you wanted to, and use this reverb to make the track sound more full. And that's it. That is the reverb tutorial. A lot of ideas that you can use the reverb for. It was such a simple and old effect. Very, very cool. I've linked down in this description and the MB14 video about reverb that explains the math behind it a little bit, as well as some more information about reverbs in general by one of my favorite creators as well. With all that said, let's look at several ideas that we can use the reverb for.
What could possibly be happening right now? What is this feeling of anticipation that you're experiencing? The demons in your brain feed the transient stress-related paranoia with a dissociative personality. It's an enigma. The MindBrain is a terrible thing to...